Okay, now in Chapter 7 so far, we've looked at the unemployment rate. Now what we want to think about is how wages are determined, right? Now, obviously, when you take a class sort of on labor economics, you're going to go into a lot more detail. You're going to talk about things like education, experience. You're going to talk about, discrimination, both gender discrimination, racial discrimination, ageism. What we're looking for in macroeconomics is not sort of the micro determinants of wages, but rather the macro determinants of wages. What are the things that are affecting all workers at the same time? And so, obviously, since we spend so much time talking about the unemployment rate, unemployment is going to be one of those. So we want to think about wage determination, and then we're going to take that the next step and think about price determination, with the understanding that wages are one of the main determinants of how firms set their prices, because wages are their main costs. So wage determination varies a lot depending on which economy you're talking about, right? So in some economies, collective bargaining between unions and firms, or even unions and entire industries, are very important. In the United States, collective bargaining is much less important than in other countries, and much less important than it used to be, right? Private sector unionization has fallen, to like 6%. Public sector unionization is still important, but it's a smaller piece. So about 10% of U.S. workers' wages are set by collective bargaining. Then obviously there are going to be some individuals where there's a lot of bargaining between employers and individual employees. If you're LeBron James, you have a lot of bargaining power. Whereas if you are, getting a minimum wage job at a fast food restaurant, you basically have no bargaining power. You can, the firm will offer you a wage, and you can either take it or leave it, right? The only option you have is to leave it. If they find that they're not able to hire enough workers at that wage, then they will have to increase the wage offer, but they're not going to generally bargain on an individual basis. And then, as we said, collective bargaining is much more important in other advanced economies, like countries in Europe and like Japan. So what we want to think about then is bargaining power in general and how that relates to reservation wages. So a reservation wage is basically the minimum wage that a worker would need to do the job, right? And so if you are being paid your reservation wage, then you're completely indifferent between having the job or being unemployed. Now, for some workers, that reservation wage might be very low because they don't have any other options, right? So it's better to earn something than nothing. For other workers, the reservation wage might be quite high. They might have savings. They might be able to collect unemployment benefits. They might have a spouse that is working. So reservation wages can vary quite a bit, and will impact people's bargaining power, right? If you can walk away from a job offer because you feel that the wage is too low, it's below your reservation wage, that increases your bargaining power. But from a macroeconomic position, one of the most important things is going to be the unemployment rate. So the lower is the unemployment rate, the higher firms are going to have to have wages in order to attract workers. And that's true for a number of reasons. One is that with a lower unemployment rate, it is harder to find workers. And two is that there are just more options, right? So usually, with a low unemployment rate, that leads to that's a high employment to population ratio. And so there's going to be people looking for jobs and finding them, getting those offers. That's going to be pushing up wages. So if we think about workers' bargaining power, we can think about, how costly is it for the firm to find other workers? It's going to be higher when the unemployment rate is lower. And then how hard is it for workers to find another job if they were to leave the firm? And as we saw, job openings tend to be higher in expansions than in recessions. And it's generally easier to find a job if the unemployment rate is low. Now, bargaining power, we should also say, depends on all the things that you learn in labor economics as well. It depends on sort of the, your education, your skills, how scarce your skills are, all sorts of things. But we're talking about sort of a macroeconomic picture here. So we think in general that if you're a firm, you don't want to pay your workers exactly their reservation wage, because if you're paying them their reservation wage, they're completely indifferent between being unemployed and having this job. That implies that they're not going to work very hard. That implies that they don't really care if they get laid off. And so efficiency wage theory basically says, all right, so firms are going to pay employees more than their reservation wage, and because of that, workers are going to work harder. And I think it's really important when you think about the labor market to understand that even though we call it a labor market, like a market for cars or a market for oranges, it's really different, right? And it's different because we're talking about human beings. When we're talking about human beings that can, not work hard at all and not care about their job, and human beings that can really work hard and be productive when they feel like they're being paid well and they're being valued. So in general, we think firms will pay what we call efficiency wages, which will be wages that sort of maximize the sort of cost of effort, right? You can't necessarily pay them, in order to give maximum effort, because that might cost too much and that might not be profitable. But there's going to be some wage above the reservation wage that maximizes sort of productivity per wage, and that will tend to be the wages that prevail, right? We won't necessarily see sort of base minimum wages in the labor market. Although, of course, we do kind of see that in some areas, and that's why minimum wages are important for some groups of workers, right? Workers who have very little bargaining power, the minimum wage can be an important floor in order to make sure that they are paid fairly. So I think every economics textbook that talks about wages and efficiency is mandated by law to discuss the Henry Ford example. So the idea here was that in 1914, Henry Ford had been experiencing really high turnover, right? So the turnover was 370%, the layoff rate was 62%. And this is not surprising, right? Factory work was new and people didn't really like it. And they were earning, $2.30 a day for a 9-hour day, which was better wages than they had been getting, say, on as a farm laborer, but the work was so much worse that people were quitting all the time. And that's expensive for firms, right? If you have to keep hiring workers, with a turnover rate of 370%, you have to hire more than 4 workers for the same job every year. And so Henry Ford said, all right, this isn't working. I'm going to increase the pay from $2.30 a day to $5 a day. And by 1915, the turnover rate had fallen to 16%, and the layoff rate had fallen to 0.1%. And so I think this shows 2 things, right? One is that people are more willing to accept sort of worse conditions if they are paid better. And 2 is that they will work harder if they have more to keep, right? So that layoff rate is important because if people had not worked harder, then we would expect the layoff rate to still be high. But they did work harder, and so the layoff rate went to almost 0. And the turnover rate went to 16%, which means you only have to hire 1 worker every 6 years instead of 4 workers every year. Now, my history colleague, Professor Eric Loomis, will say, okay, but that doesn't mean Henry Ford was a good employer. He was still a bad person, and he still tried to control his workers' lives, and he still was, not necessarily a good person, and I think that's completely fair, right? The key isn't that he did this out of the goodness of his own heart. The key is that he did this to maximize profits. And you can see that even though he more than doubled his pay, it was worth it to him because he got workers working harder and staying in the job for a much longer period of time. All right, so now we're going to do a little bit of economic modeling, and we're going to think about our nominal wage W. And remember, this is kind of like an average wage for the entire economy. So we're not thinking about education levels, we're not thinking about experience, we're not thinking about productivity necessarily. We're just thinking about, we will think about productivity in total later on. But we just want to have a few things that will determine our overall wage. So one is going to be the expected price level. So that's P with a superscript of E. And that's important because workers, if the price level is going up, workers are going to need more nominal wage in order to buy the same stuff. So that's going to be important. The unemployment rate, U, and we're in everything else, sort of a catch-all variable, Z. So all of those things that are going to affect wages that aren't the unemployment rate or the price level. So you can see wages here are going up 1 for 1 with the price level. They are going down when the unemployment rate goes up, and just by construction, we're going to assume that they go up when Z goes up. And what is Z? We'll talk about that in a minute. But Z is going to be a lot of things that affect the labor market, like unemployment benefits, the minimum wage, anything that, unionization could affect Z as well. So all of those things that will affect the labor market. So what we really care about is real wages, right? How much stuff can you actually buy with your wage? W over P rather than nominal wage. We're saying that the nominal wage depends on the expected price level because, you say you're setting your wages January 1st, you don't know what the price level is going to be by December. And so obviously the price level is changing for a year. These days, prices change pretty slowly. But that's not always true, right? Sometimes you have periods of high inflation where prices are changing every month. And so, your real wage in December might be significantly less than it was in January if the nominal wage hasn't changed. Our assumption here is that an increase in the unemployment rate, so when U goes up, our nominal wages go down, right? That was the negative sign under the U. And we've already said that when the unemployment rate is higher, that weakens workers' bargaining power and allows firms to pay lower wages or offer lower wages. One thing that I think this is kind of it's not exactly true. Sort of what we really see is that wages tend not to go down very often. Nominal wages, that is. But what we'll see with a low unemployment rate is that wages, won't go up at all. I mean, with a high unemployment rate, they won't go up. And with a low unemployment rate, they will go up. And so that's really the same story, but a little bit different. And then, as we said, Z stands for everything else. So that could be, unemployment benefits, how generous are they? Employment protection rules that make it harder for workers to be fired. As I said, unions. Anything that's going to affect how wages are determined. All right, so we've got wages as a relationship to the expected price level and the unemployment rate and everything else. Now we want to think about prices. And in order to think about prices, we need to think about a production function. Usually with a production function, we have inputs, labor, and usually capital, and an output. Now, for a macroeconomic production function, our output is GDP, so that's just Y. We're going to focus on employment here, right? We will introduce capital again in the long run, but for now we're just going to have employment, so that's N. And then A is technology. It's sort of the solo residual. It's the labor productivity, output per worker. So if technology gets better, every worker is able to produce more. So here our production function is very, very simple. Y is equal to A times N. So N is the number of workers, A is the labor productivity, and Y is output or GDP. So our input is labor and technology. Our output is GDP. And so now what we want to think about is, okay, well, how do we think about prices? So since A is just a linear relationship, we're just going to assume it's 1 for now. When we get into sort of our long-run growth, well, then we'll relax that assumption. And so that means that if you're producing output with workers, then the cost of producing one more unit of output is the cost of hiring one more worker, which is just the wage, W. Now, these are obviously simplifying assumptions, right? But basically, the idea is if you want to produce more output, you got to hire more workers. The cost of hiring a worker is W. So the marginal cost is W. And then we're going to assume that firms have some markup over the cost. And so this is reasonable, although of course the markup varies widely depending on the industry. And what we're assuming is that there is one markup for the entire economy. So that's going to be M. So in this case, if W is our marginal cost, M is our markup, then the price is just equal to 1 plus M times W. So for instance, say that the wage is $20. Say that the markup is 10%. 1 plus 10% would be 1.1 times 20 is 22. So in that case, the price would be 22. So then the price is going to go up when the wages go up, and it's going to go up when the markup goes up, and vice versa, right? It will go down if either of those two go down.